Hi, and welcome to this sixth presentation in the workshop Bullets and Banknotes, War Financing Through the 20th Century. Today, it is my great pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Panarat Anamwathana. Dr. Anamwathana received her doctorate from Oxford earlier this year. She is currently lecturer in economic history at the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Thammasat University in Bangkok, Thailand. Her thesis focused on the economic history of Thailand during the 1940s and 1950s. She sought to understand how foreign aid played a role in the kingdom's development. Her appearance at the Economic History Society Conference 2019 in Belfast won the prize for the best paper by a new researcher. Today, Pan will be presenting Wartime Finance and Occupation Costs, Thailand under Japanese rule, 1941 to 1945. Her paper seeks to understand the economics behind the Japanese occupation of the country. Of particular note are the financial strategies which led to Thailand financing its own occupation. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Dr. Anamwathana.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having me. So today my paper is on wartime finance and occupation costs, Thailand under Japanese rule was 1941 to 1945. In December of 1941, Japanese troops arrived at the southern Thai border, and the prime minister was nowhere to be found. He's kind of disappeared. And with no commander-in-chief, the Thai army at the southern border engaged in a couple of hours of fighting. And then at the end, the prime minister reappeared and ordered a ceasefire. And this led to Thailand becoming a quote-unquote alliance, or entering into a quote-unquote alliance with Japan, and essentially being incorporated into Japan's wartime empire, or the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And so even though Thailand was technically an ally of Japan, it wasn't an equal ally, and it was technically under Japanese occupation during the Second World War. And so today, this paper seeks to understand, as David said earlier, the strategies of financing that occupation, as well as the financial repercussions of being under Japanese occupation for Thailand. So existing literature on the subject, there hasn't been that much on the economic consequences of Japanese occupation of Thailand. So on kind of larger picture wartime Thailand, historians that study general economic development tend to skip the 1940s and kind of just either go from 1850s to the 1930s and then from 1950s onwards. Literature or historical research that have been conducted on wartime Thailand has mostly been about sort of the political and international relations aspect of the country, because it was quite interesting as there was kind of like a Charles de Gaulle resistance during the Thailand's occupation, because so they formed what is known as the Free Thai movement and marched with the Allies when they reconquered Burma in 1945. So this was kind of why Thailand wasn't considered a losing country in World War II, because the United States recognized that this resistance or the Free Thai movement kind of was actually represented the actual of the Thai people and not the Thai government at the time. And because Thailand was such an important rice exporter, a lot of historians, most notably Kratoska and Batson, have studied the impact of the rice industry, which kind of just crumbled under Japanese rule, but did not really look at the larger economic context. On wartime finance in Thailand, Huff and Majima look at sort of the Japanese the Japanese financing its own occupation, Thailand financing Japan's occupation during the war, but kind of looking at Southeast Asia as a whole, but they didn't really look at Thai sources, and they didn't really consider sort of the kind of how Thailand like coped with this the consequences of like having to finance its own occupation. William Swan has written a great deal on the Japanese occupation of Thailand and the financial relationship between Japan and Thailand, but he relies a lot on Japanese sources, and actually his view of the finance during Japan's occupation of Thailand is a view that I'm seeking to argue with and perhaps offer a different perspective using Thai sources, because Swan thinks that because Thailand had a nominally independent government, and it could sort of negotiate with Japan in arguing with how to properly finance the war and the occupation of Thailand. Thailand actually had some kind of say in kind of the financial system of the occupation. And he sort of looks at, how long it took the Japanese and Thai officials to agree on the terms. But, and that was kind of like proof of how Thailand sort of had a kind of independence and had its financial system wasn't completely taken over. Whereas today I will use Thai sources and kind of give a different perspective on that, and say that even though Thai officials had could negotiate, the outcome of those negotiations didn't actually really help Thailand that much, and it didn't really actually have a say in how much money was being printed in the country during the occupation. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I guess the larger aim of this paper is to kind of integrate wartime Thailand and the financial dislocation during the 1940s into kind of the larger context of Thai financial and economic development. So as you can see here, the current historiography kind of excludes the Japanese occupation. But what I'm aiming to do with this paper is to fill in this gap in the historiography that was previously kind of sort of ignored, or if written about, not written about based on resources in Thailand. And I'm looking to, as I said, integrate this experience into long-term Thai financial development. So I argue that during the Japanese occupation, we see the end of the European influence on Thai financial system. The Thai Central Bank was founded, and what we see is a rise of indigenous Thai-owned commercial banks, which then led to private capital consolidation and changes in the economic structure of Thailand after the war. So yeah, let's get into the finance stuff. Before that. So these are the sources that I rely on. So mostly they come from the National Archives and the National Library of Thailand in Bangkok, as well as the statistical yearbooks and the Bank of Thailand yearly reports as well. So these are the Thai sources that I mainly rely on. So before we get into the war, I guess I should give some context of pre-war kind of the Thai financial industry before the Japanese occupation. So it was basically still in its infancy. There weren't a lot of commercial banks, and most of the banks that were in Thailand at the time were European, or mostly European banks. And they were exchange banks, so they were mostly there to facilitate international trade, and they didn't really lend money to a lot of Thais. there were some local Chinese banks. So Thailand had a sizable Chinese minority, and they were based mostly in the capital, in Bangkok. So these Chinese banks mostly lent to other Sino-Thai or ethnically Chinese people in Thailand. And they were all very much tied into the rice trade, because the Chinese mostly were middlemen in the rice trade, and they also owned a lot of rice mills in Thailand. And they suffered a lot during the Great Depression. So there's actually some research being done about the Chinese bank failures in the 1930s, and they failed because they were basically all tied up into the rice trade, which got into a lot of trouble during the Great Depression. So there weren't a lot of commercial banks. The royal family tried to establish a bank, and which was a commercial bank, but it was mostly utilized by the elites in Bangkok, and everyone else didn't really have a culture of depositing money in a current or a savings account at all. There was also not a central bank, so the Ministry of Finance was mostly in charge of all public finance. Currency and the volume of money in circulation basically just responded to the balance of payments. So if they had a trade surplus, then the volume of money in the country increased. And the National Banking Bureau, that was founded just 2 years before the Japanese invasion, it was founded to basically just regulate commercial banking activities, but it really didn't have a lot of Thai commercial banking activities to regulate. So so this was kind of the financial system of Thailand before the Japanese came in and occupied the country. So upon entering into an alliance with Japan, the Thai government and I guess the Japanese army now had to figure out ways to finance the occupation. So the three main ways basically to finance the war, as I'm sure all the other papers have discussed, is by increasing taxes, which was basically very difficult in wartime Thailand, because people's incomes have kind of just been lost, and a large majority of Thai citizens were farmers, and so it was very difficult to, I guess, collect more income tax from rice farmers because they couldn't even sell their rice at the time. The second option was to sell bonds, but as I've said before, because there were very few commercial banks and very few people actually had access to them, it really wasn't a viable option. There wasn't really a culture of Thai people buying bonds. The Thai government did try to sell bonds, and it ended up selling most of it to the Bank of Thailand because the public just wasn't buying up the bonds that the government needed. And so it kind of fell to the last and final option, which was to print money to I guess, to finance the Japanese occupation at the time. So during the Japanese occupation, Thailand signed 2 bilateral agreements with Japan, which I'll get to in a minute. It led to large government deficits. And of course, there were other forms of resource extraction by Japan at the time as well, which all led to an increase in money supply and inflation. And a rise in the cost of living. So these are the 2 bilateral agreements that Thailand and Japan signed. And these are the bilateral agreements that William Swan studied and looked at the whole kind of long process of negotiation. But as you can see, the terms are actually very, very bad for Thailand. So the first agreement is the Baht-Yen Parity Agreement, which basically means that Thailand had to devalue its currency by 1/3. So before that, 100 baht could buy about 155 yen. But Japan said that, oh, now that you're part of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and every other country in the sphere, its currency was pegged to the yen, Thailand also had to peg its currency to the yen and have devalue the baht to be on parity with the yen. And obviously this meant that Japanese merchants could buy Thai goods for cheaper, but the special yen agreement was only in effect for a month or two. And then the special yen agreement, which is the second bilateral agreement, came up, and it basically stated that Thailand had to print baht for Japanese use in Thailand, and the Thai government would be credited with special yen in its account in Japan. And this special yen theoretically could be used to purchase goods from Japan and, import those goods back into Thailand. But as I'll get to in a minute, these special yen couldn't actually be used. One, because the Japanese merchants kind of knew that these special yen were pretty much useless, and there are primary sources of the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Finance kind of detailing people trying to purchase Japanese goods with special yen, and the Japanese companies are saying we'd rather be paid in baht because we know that these special yen are just really useless credits. And so due to the special yen agreement, it necessitated the establishment of a central bank because the Japanese wanted, I guess, an entity to produce money for the Japanese army, as well as somebody to hold these special yen credits in the account in Japan. And this basically just said that Thailand, it basically means that Thailand lost control of its money supply, because however much money Japan needed Thailand to print, the Bank of Thailand had to print them. And it was only compensated with these useless special yen credits that couldn't be spent on anything. But this meant, so this is statistics of Japanese merchant shipping. So the special yen agreement basically meant that Japan could extract as much resources from Thailand as it wanted, and it was only limited by Thailand's literal, physical ability to provide these resources, because Japan could basically just order the Bank of Thailand to print however much money it wanted. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for Thailand, Japanese merchant shipping was kind of destroyed by Allied submarines. So as you can see, the shipping capacity of Japan in 1945 was only about 10% of what it was in 1941. So that kind of limited the effect of the special yen agreement towards the end of the war, because there was no point in Japan buying up all of these goods in Thailand because they couldn't ship it back to Japan anyway. But this did lead to other problems, as Thailand was unable to trade with Japan during the war, but I guess that's a different paper. So yeah, but this is a limit to the special yen agreement, which was not really built into the agreement. It was just because of the actual circumstances of the war. So that was one of the reasons for Thailand having to print a lot of money during the war. This is the second reason. So this shows the revenues of the Thai government. And as you can see, customs and tax revenues are quite important. And as you can see, customs as a percentage of total revenues fell quite drastically during the war, and that was basically because Thailand couldn't trade with its usual trading partners, which are usually countries in Europe, and because Japanese merchant shipping, as I said before, basically got destroyed by Allied submarines. So this means that the revenues of the Thai government were shrinking, while its expenditures on defense and on trying to, I guess, keep the country going during the war going up. So the budget deficit of the Thai government was also rapidly increasing at the time as well. So this led to a lot of money being printed in Thailand. And so the government would sell bonds to the Bank of Thailand, which then would print a lot of money as, you know, the government required. So as you can see, by the end of the war, the total amount of money that was printed for a budget deficit was about 300 million baht, but it was 1.5 billion baht was printed for the Japanese army to spend in the country. And the amount of notes in Thailand just increased dramatically during these 4 years of the Japanese occupation. So this is an example of, I guess, other types of resource extraction. So this is a picture of the Thai-Burma Railway, which obviously used prisoner of war labor, and they worked under horrible and inhumane conditions. So this is kind of what happened to the money supply, as well as the cost of living in Thailand during the war. So you can see there's a big spike in the cost of living index, and the money supply also increased, I guess, like twofold during the war as well. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting for Thailand, because obviously there's very high inflation. But in times of very high inflation, you would not expect the cost of living index to be comparable to the volume of money, as I'm sure, I guess, other papers maybe have talked about, because rational people in times of very high inflation, they would get money and they would spend it as quickly as they get it, because they know that the longer they hold on to it, the less that money is worth. Which increases the velocity of money and then drives up the cost of living. But this didn't really happen in Thailand. It kind of was very comparable. Oh yes, and let me just go back to that. So the reason for that is because the government tried to limit inflation. So they limited, public spending. They tried to increase their revenues by, increasing like how much it costs to post a letter to your friends in the country, and stopped hiring new civil servants. It tried to increase the availability of goods and services, which obviously was an issue because Thailand couldn't trade at the time. And so it did try to produce some of these goods domestically, and it wasn't really very successful. And it tried to restrict private spending by, they had this thing called savings cards that Thai people would have to buy. And so it was basically just taking money out of the hands of the people so that they wouldn't spend it and drive up inflation. But this wasn't, as I'm sure you could probably figure out, this doesn't sound like it would stop very high inflation, especially during a war. So there must be other explanations. So one is that there aren't really other substitutes for currency. So because Thailand's economy was quite homogenous, most people grew rice and grew their own vegetables. They couldn't really barter because everyone kind of had the same goods. There were strong sort of transactional motives for holding money. Japanese soldiers would buy goods with baht, with the baht that was printed, and the wages and taxes still had to be paid in baht. So these are sort of some of the reasons. And there was relative political stability. So I guess unlike other countries that were colonized by a European power, and then Japan came over and then kicked out the Europeans and then established some sort of puppet government, Thailand had the same leader from I think 1937 until 1944, when he was ousted, because it was very clear that Japan was going to lose the war by then. There are also structural reasons. So the British financial advisor to Thailand sort of made this observation that he thought that all of the notes that were being printed, only about 20 to 25% of them were circulating in Bangkok, and the rest kind of went into the countryside. And this is because the Thai government realized that these peasants needed an outlet for their agricultural produce. And so they bought a lot of these, so it was mostly rice and vegetables. And they didn't really have anywhere to store them, so they kind of sat in warehouses. But this meant that a lot of the money kind of went outside of Bangkok, but there wasn't really any reason for it to flow back in, or there wasn't really any reason why this money would be spent, because there are very few goods that reached rural Thailand at the time. So this was part of the reason why inflation wasn't higher during the war in Thailand. This is just to show the real wages for workers during the war. So skilled workers are bureaucrats, low-ranking governmental bureaucrats, and then the unskilled workers are construction workers in Bangkok and in rural Thailand. And yes, you can see, because inflation was so high and nominal wages didn't keep up with it, their real wages fell dramatically during this time. And so I guess I'm just about out of time. So in conclusion, the occupation costs were limited by the loss of merchant shipping, but it was still very damaging to Thailand. And this led to a rise in inflation, the cost of living, and I guess inflation wasn't higher because Thais were still sort of willing to hold on to money during the war. I guess very quickly, the financial repercussions of the war were severe. So Thailand lost a lot of its currency reserves because it spent used some currency reserves to make up for the deficit, and it also had its accounts frozen in the UK, which was very angry at Thailand because it led Japan, set up bases in Thailand and then went on to attack Burma and Malaya. And obviously high inflation and an unsustainable exchange rate, which was pegged to the yen. So this led to the government monopolizing rice exports and using a multiple exchange rate system to sort of profit from Thai rice, which was in very high demand after the war. And it used that to stabilize the country, the country's financial system after the war. And the Bank of Thailand was very important in this process, because it was the one that made sure that the proceeds from the monopolization of rice exports and the multiple exchange rate went into actually stabilizing the exchange, the financial system, and building up currency reserves, and kind of not just squandered on useless government projects. And it also sort of had very conservative monetary policies in the post-war period. And a lot of scholars and I as well agree that this was because of the experience of very high inflation during the war left a very sour taste in these technocrats' mouths, and they really did not want Thailand to go back to having very high inflation. There was also a growth of branch banking in Thailand, which after the Japanese drove out European banks, indigenous banks were founded at the time and kind of spread in the post-war period. So yeah, I guess I'm out of time, and I look forward to your question, David.
Okay, great. Well, thank you ever so much for your talk, Pan. I learned a great deal, in fact. It's really, really interesting subject. Thank you very much for that. So, for my question, So why did the confidence in the baht not disappear despite the high inflation that you were talking about during the war?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a question that I get asked a lot. And so I'm assuming, well, my answer is that because the baht was, you know, it was going to be backed up by the Thai government, and the Thai government is likely to remain there regardless of the outcome of the war. So Thai people knew that, you know, if they just held on to the baht, it doesn't matter that if Japan lost the war, the Thai government wasn't going to fall, and they could, even though there's nothing to buy now, they can hold on to it. And then in the future, when there are things to buy again, they can still use that money in the future. So I think the political stability of the Thai government backing the baht is really the reason why that the confidence in the currency did not erode during the war. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you ever so much for your talk, Pan. And yeah, please join us again for the next talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.